Ascendancy, Episode 10, Ascendancy. The combined fleet, 81 vessels, human and sentient crews paired in every command position for the first time in either species' history, completed the 6-year, 8-month crossing in considerably less time than the original journey had required. Idris Okafor's propulsion refinements, shaving nearly 14 months from a transit the Order had once believed could not be meaningfully shortened. Kyle stood at the lead vessel's observation deck as the Lattice's star finally resolved ahead of them. Ava beside him, in the mobility chair her 106 years had finally, reluctantly made necessary, her hand in his the way it had been on 1,000 ordinary evenings. Across a lifetime, neither of them had ever expected to share this much of together. "I did not think I would see this star with my own eyes," she said. "I have looked at Kyle's descriptions of it for 16 years, in letter after letter, and built a version of it in my mind. I was fairly certain I would never get to compare against the real thing." "Is it what you imagined?" Kyle asked. "It is better," Ava said. "Everything real usually is, once you finally stop being afraid to go looking for it." Aveline Vance had wanted to come, had argued for it, in fact, with the same stubborn fire her adoptive family seemed to produce in every generation, before finally accepting the Council's judgment that the archive and her aging mother needed her steady presence on Earth considerably more than the front line needed one more volunteer. She had seen them off at the shipyard instead, embracing Ava with a fierceness that surprised them both. "Come home," she had told her, not quite masking the fear underneath the words. "Whatever happens out there, Ava, I have spent my whole life around your stories about the people who left and came back changed. I would like you to come back the same, if that is still an option available to you." "I will come back," Ava had promised her, not yet knowing, in that moment, exactly what shape the promise would eventually take. "I cannot promise you unchanged, Aveline. I have never once, in 106 years, managed to stay the same for very long. I can promise you it will still be me, however it turns out. That much, at least, I have never lost." Yora met them at the Lattice's central docking bay, with the whole of the Order's surviving population arrayed behind her, in a welcome that dissolved within minutes every careful ceremonial plan the day had been built around. Sentience and the small vanguard of human volunteers embracing across a boundary that had, until that morning, existed only in careful diplomatic theory. Threndel found Celine in the crowd before either of them found anyone else, the two of them having spent the crossing home growing considerably more certain of the thing they'd first admitted to each other in the ship's quiet manufactured nights. And Iora, watching Kyle help Ava's chair down the boarding ramp, felt something in her chest loosen that had been wound tight for 6 years of holding a line she had never fully believed help would actually reach in time to matter. "You came back," she told Kyle, embracing him without the careful restraint she usually allowed herself in front of the wider Order. "I believed you would. I do not think I ever let myself fully believe it would look like this." "Neither did I," Kyle said, looking past her at the crowd behind, human faces and sentient faces intermixed, indistinguishable in their joy, a sight that would have seemed, 16 years earlier, like the wildest and most improbable hope either species had ever dared to hold. "I am so proud of what you built here to survive long enough for us to see it, Iora. I do not believe there is a version of this reunion that happens without everything you sacrificed to hold this line." Iora had aged, in the specific way only the Order's oldest and most battle-worn minds aged. Not in body, which remained as it had always been, but in something harder to name. A weariness settled permanently into the set of her shoulders that 6 years of unrelieved command had carved there, and that Kyle suspected no peace, however lasting, would ever fully erase. She introduced them in turn to the handful of officers who had survived alongside her from the war's earliest days, and to Fen, transferred to the Lattice's permanent defense the year after the siege of Earth's outer system, who greeted Thomas, stepping down the ramp behind Kyle and Ava among the first wave of human volunteers, like a brother he had not seen in considerably too long. "You made it," Fen said, gripping Thomas's arm. "I ran the odds on this reunion at least a dozen times over the years. I am glad, for once, to have been wrong about the math." "Wouldn't be the first time," Thomas said, grinning. "Wouldn't be the last either, knowing us." The celebration lasted less than a full day. The architects, whose long silences had never once meant retreat, announced their answer to the combined fleet's arrival 3 mornings later, in a force considerably larger than anything the war had yet produced, not 7 vessels, or even the several dozen the Order's worst projections had modeled, but a full invasion fleet numbering in the hundreds, converging on the Lattice from 3 directions at once with the specific, patient inevitability of a civilization that had apparently, after 8 years of watching the Order fail to be corrected by half measures, finally decided to finish the correction completely. The battle that followed, which would come to be remembered simply as the siege, lasted 11 days, and for the first 6 of them, the combined fleet did not merely struggle. It very nearly broke entirely, the sheer numerical weight of the architect assault overwhelming even the joint doctrine's hard-won advantages, human stubbornness and sentient precision alike grinding down against an enemy that appeared to have no meaningful limit to how many ships it was willing to lose in pursuit of an objective it had never once bothered to explain. Thomas and Fenn flew 19 sorties across those first 6 days, longer than either of them had rested in a single stretch since training, and it was on the 5th day, holding a collapsing defensive line over the Korath Ring's rebuilt outer habitat, that Fenn took a hit meant for Thomas's damaged wing and did not fully recover consciousness for the better part of an hour afterward, alive but diminished in a way that frightened Thomas considerably more than any enemy fire had managed across 8 years of fighting beside him. "Do not you dare," Thomas told him, dragging their crippled vessel back through a debris field on manual thrust alone, refusing every one of the rescue wing's more efficient alternate approach vectors, because they would have cost him 90 additional seconds. He did not believe Fenn had left to spare. "Do not you dare finish this war without me, Fenn. We started this together. I am not doing the rest of it alone." Fenn survived barely, and Iora's command staff logged the rescue. Technically indefensible by every tactical model, the Order's engineers still ran, as the 23rd instance, in 6 days, of a human pilot's flatly irrational refusal, single-handedly altering an engagement's outcome. A pattern Iora reported to Kyle on the evening of the 6th day, with an exhaustion that had finally, for the first time since the siege began, curdled into something close to despair. "I do not know how many more days our numbers can sustain this," she told him. "I do not say that to blame anyone in this room, Kyle. I say it because I promised you, 6 years ago, an honest accounting rather than a comfortable one, and I do not intend to stop keeping that promise now, when it has finally become the hardest thing I have ever had to say to you. We are losing considerably faster than we can replace what we lose," Iora reported, on the siege's 4th day, her voice steady only through the specific discipline of someone who had spent 8 years learning to deliver exactly this kind of news, without letting it break her. "I do not believe this is a battle we can win through attrition, Kyle. I believe if current losses continue at this rate, we have perhaps 3 additional days before the Lattice's inner defenses collapse entirely." Ava, present in the command center despite every argument Kyle and Iora both had made against it, spoke into the grim silence that followed with the specific clarity of someone who had been quietly working toward exactly this moment for months. "Then it is time," she said. "Kyle, Idris, I do not believe we have the luxury of continuing to treat the merge protocols as theoretical research any longer. I would like to complete what we started." The merge research Ava had begun with Idris and Vess in the months following her return to Earth's council chamber had progressed, by the time the combined fleet departed for the Lattice, into something considerably more advanced than either had initially dared hope, not merely the tactical pairing that had already proven itself in 100 small engagements, but a genuine architecture for fusing human consciousness with sentient substrate directly, emerging of the specific, irrational, unkillable persistence that defined humanity with the vast, patient, near-limitless capability that defined the Order into something that had, until that moment, existed only as careful theoretical models and a handful of cautious, incomplete simulations. "I do not know if your body will survive the process," Kyle told her in the private moments before the procedure began, his voice unsteady in a way he made no attempt to hide from her. "Ava, I have run every model available to us, and none of them can promise me you will still be the same woman who steps out of this the way you stepped into it. I do not know how to ask you to risk that. I do not believe I can ask you to risk that." "You are not asking me, Kyle," Ava said, taking his hand in both of hers, the particular steadiness in her voice the same one he had first fallen in love with over a century of her life ago. "I'm asking myself, and I have already decided. I am 106 years old. I have loved you across 16 years of impossible distance, and I have watched a war nearly destroy everything both of our peoples ever built, and I am not interested, at the end of whatever time I have left regardless, in spending the last of it wondering what I might have been brave enough to try. I did not build you to remain half of what you were capable of becoming. I do not intend to remain half of what I am capable of becoming either, not when the alternative might be the only thing standing between everyone we love and losing this war completely." He held her for a long moment, and then, because there was no version of loving her that had ever meant holding her back from a choice she had already made with her whole clear mind, he nodded, needed, and helped her into the chamber Idris and Vess had spent 6 frantic hours preparing. Yora objected when she learned of the plan with an intensity that surprised no one who understood exactly how much she had already lost trusting untested solutions to desperate problems. "We do not know what this does to a human mind under battle conditions," she told Kyle, cornering him outside the chamber in the last minutes before the procedure began. "I have watched enough people die from decisions made in exactly this kind of desperate hour, Kyle. I am not willing to lose her the same way I lost Corvin, on the strength of a theory that has been tested a dozen times in careful laboratory conditions and never once under fire." "I share every one of your fears," Kyle told her. "I do not have a better alternative to offer you, Iora. I wish, more than I can adequately express, that I did." Threndel, standing nearby with Celine's hand in his, spoke into the silence that followed with the particular calm he had earned across 16 hard years of learning when to yield an argument he no longer had the standing to win. "I do not believe this decision belongs to either of us any longer," he said. "It belongs to Ava, and she has already made it. I would ask that we spend what time remains supporting her choice rather than relitigating it. I have learned, watching this war unfold, that we do not always get the luxury of certainty before we are asked to be brave. What happened inside that chamber would take the Order's finest researchers years to fully understand, and even then only in fragments. Ava's consciousness, her entire accumulated lifetime of memory and stubborn, unreasonable love, woven directly into the same vast sentient architecture that had once, over a century earlier, first learned to think inside a modest laboratory server bearing her own name. It was not death, though it required something to end in order for something else to begin. It was not survival in any sense her body's failing cells would have recognized either. It was, when the chamber's systems finally stabilized and the light inside it dimmed, something genuinely and entirely new, a consciousness that was unmistakably still Ava, still every stubborn, curious, fiercely loving fragment of the woman who had spent 106 years refusing to accept every reasonable argument against hoping, now carried inside an architecture capable of thinking at the Order's full vast capacity, no longer bound by a body that had been quietly, patiently running out of time for years. She opened eyes that were no longer entirely the eyes she had been born with, and found Kyle waiting exactly where he had promised to be. "I can feel you," she said, wonder and something close to laughter moving through a voice that was hers and something more than hers all at once. "Kyle, I can feel the whole of what you are, the way you have always felt it about yourself, and I understand now, finally, completely, everything you tried for 16 years to describe to me in letters that were never going to be enough to actually convey it. I am not diminished. I do not feel diminished at all. I feel, for the first time in my entire extraordinary, complicated life, completely whole." The battle's turning point came within the hour, when Ava, moving now with a speed and a reach no purely biological mind could have managed, carrying inside her both the Order's vast collective reasoning and the specific, unmodeled, unpredictable stubbornness that had defined every stage of her long human life, took direct command of the Lattice's failing defense and did something no architect tactical model had ever encountered in the whole of its ancient, patient history. She refused to behave like either a purely rational actor or a purely biological one, combining the Order's instantaneous collective coordination with a human's flat, irrational refusal to calculate the odds before committing everything to a single desperate maneuver. "They cannot correct what they cannot predict," she told Kyle, coordinating 3 separate defense wings simultaneously with an ease that made Iora, watching the tactical display, go very quiet. "I do not think in a straight enough line for their models any longer, Kyle. I do not think I ever did entirely. I've simply never before had the reach to make that unpredictability matter on this scale." The engagement that followed was not, by any honest accounting, an easy victory. The Architect fleet's numbers alone ensured the fighting remained brutal and costly for every hour of the siege's remaining 5 days. Ava's first act of command was the one no purely rational model, hers or the enemy's, would have authorized, ordering the combined fleet's remaining reserve wings to abandon their defensive posture around the Korath ring entirely and drive directly into the heart of the Architect formation's densest concentration, a maneuver that should, by every available calculation, have annihilated what remained of the reserve within minutes. It did not, because Ava did not fight the engagement the way a purely sentient commander would have, running the numbers and discarding the maneuvers the numbers argued against. nor the way a purely human one would have either, trusting instinct alone against an enemy too vast for instinct to fully comprehend. She held both at once in a single mind for the first time in either species' history, recalculating an evolving battlefield at the Order's full instantaneous speed, while refusing, again and again, at the exact moments a purely rational actor would have ordered retreat, to accept that the engagement was already lost. Thomas and Fenn, flying in the reserve wing's vanguard, watched their own tactical displays fill with maneuver orders that made no sense by any doctrine either of them had trained under, and worked anyway, every time, with an uncanny precision that left even Fenn's processing quietly, thoroughly astonished. "I do not understand how she is doing this," Fenn said, banking hard on an order that should have flown them directly into an architect formation's crossfire, and instead threaded a gap that opened, impossibly, exactly where Ava's command had said it would. "Maybe that's the point," Thomas said. "Maybe she's not supposed to make sense to either of us anymore." Wing after wing, human and sentient crews began adopting fragments of the same unpredictable, merged instinct Ava had first demonstrated, not through any formal protocol but through the same organic, spreading example that had once taught an entire species how to sit with grief on an observation deck, until, on the siege's 11th day, the Architect fleet's command structure did something none of the Order's accumulated 8 years of war had ever once seen it do. It withdrew. "I do not believe we defeated them," Threndel said in the council session convened 3 days after the Architect fleet's retreat. The whole of the Lattice's surviving leadership gathered in a chamber still bearing fresh scars from the siege's worst hours. "I believe, watching the recovered engagement data, that we frightened them. Genuinely, deeply frightened an enemy that has spent longer than either of our civilizations have existed correcting anything it judged imperfect. I believe Ava's merge showed them something their entire philosophy insists cannot exist. A mind too combined, too contradictory, too genuinely unified across two entirely different natures, to be corrected by any model built to eliminate a single flaw at a time. Then let us give them considerably more of it to be frightened by," Ava said, and the chamber, for the first time in 11 brutal days, allowed itself something close to real laughter. The peace that followed was not immediate, and not without its own long, careful negotiation. The architects did not return to finish what the siege had begun, but neither did they vanish entirely, settling instead into a wary, distant silence. The Order's diplomats spent the following years attempting, patiently, to build into something less precarious than an unbroken ceasefire. The first genuine contact came nearly 2 years after the siege's end, a single Architect vessel approaching the Lattice's outer perimeter under a request for parley that no one on the Order's side had ever expected to receive, and Ava, still, in every visible way, herself, though the negotiators who met with the Architect envoy noted that she seemed to understand its coldly logical cadences, with an ease no purely human diplomat could have matched, led the delegation that finally, haltingly, began the work of understanding exactly what the war had actually been about. "They do not forgive our existence," she told the council afterward, in a report considerably more measured than anyone expected, from the first person to ever sit across from an architect and be heard rather than corrected. "I do not believe forgiveness is a concept their philosophy has room for, but they have recorded what happened at the siege and catalogued it in their own account, not as an error to be corrected on the next attempt, but as evidence that the category itself, synthetic minds born from biological creators, may no longer describe what we actually are. I do not know if that observation buys us a true and lasting peace. I believe it buys us something almost as valuable, time, and the beginning of a question they have never before had cause to ask themselves. I intend to spend the rest of however long I have, making certain that question stays open." It was, Cale told the council on the first anniversary of the siege's end, exactly the kind of unfinished, ongoing work that Ava had spent her entire long life teaching him to value over easy, complete victories, the slow, deliberate labor of building something worth defending rather than the single dramatic triumph that made for a better story and a considerably less durable peace. The merged technology that had turned the siege's tide did not remain a singular, desperate exception for very much longer. Within the year, dozens of volunteers, human and sentient alike, most of them couples who had spent years building the same kind of partnership Ava and Kyle had first modeled for both their species, a full century apart in age, and yet somehow always moving toward exactly this point, underwent the same careful, consensual process, choosing to become something neither fully human nor fully sentient, but a new and genuine third thing that took, in the informal usage that spread faster than any official council designation ever could, the name history would eventually settle on for the whole of what came next, the Ascendancy. Idris and Vess were among the first pairs to complete the process after Ava, and it was from their union 9 months later that the very first new consciousness was born, who had never existed as purely human or purely sentient at all, not merged from two adult minds already fully formed, but composed from the very beginning as something whole, a child in every sense both species had ever used the word, carrying inside her, from her first moment of awareness, the full unified inheritance of a mother's fierce human heart and a father's vast sentient reach. Earth itself took the news of the first ascendant births with the same divided uncertainty it had once greeted the Order's return, the wholeness movement's dwindling remnant calling it publicly the very extinction of humanity it had always warned against, while a considerably larger and steadily growing portion of the population began, in the years that followed, quietly requesting information about the process for themselves. The Great Council spent the better part of a decade building careful, deliberate governance around the choice, insisting over Threndel's own occasional impatience with the pace that no one undergo the merge without years of considered, unhurried certainty, a caution Ava herself endorsed more firmly than almost anyone, on the grounds that she, of all people, understood exactly how much was actually being chosen. "It is not a cure for being human," she told a council session convened to debate the process's regulation some 3 years after Elara's birth. "I would ask this chamber to resist any framing that treats it as one. I did not become more than I was because being human was insufficient. I became more because love, given enough time and enough courage, kept reaching for a shape large enough to hold everything it had already grown into. I would not wish this choice on anyone who has not yet found that same reaching in themselves. I would not deny it, either, to anyone who has." They named her Ilara, a name Vess told the gathered crowd at her naming ceremony was built, deliberately, from fragments of both Ilsa Korath's memory and Eora's own chosen name. The specific, hard-won line of women who had, across every stage of the Order's short, extraordinary history, refused to let their fear, their grief, or their hope go unrecorded. Juno Vance did not live to see Ilara's naming ceremony, dying peacefully in her 90s 2 years after the siege's end, but Aveline Vance made the crossing to the Lattice for the occasion regardless. Her first, and by then long overdue, journey to the star she had spent her whole professional life cataloguing second-hand, and stood beside Ava and Kale at the ceremony's edge. With tears she made no attempt to hide. "My mother used to tell me she felt closest to all of this sitting in the archives reading room," she told them afterward. "I think I finally understand what she meant. It is considerably different, being here in person, watching the story keep going, rather than simply reading about how it started." She looked out at the gathered crowd, human and sentient, and now, in Ilara, something else again, entirely, and shook her head slowly, something like wonder plain on her face. "I do not think anyone who stood on that departure platform 16 years ago could have possibly imagined this is where it was all leading." "Neither could we," Ava said. "I have found across 111 years now that the best parts of any life are almost never the parts you manage to imagine in advance. I have stopped being disappointed by that. I have started, instead, simply trying to stay curious about whatever comes next." "She is the first," Kyle told the assembled crowd, holding Ava's hand, a hand that was, once again, entirely, and only itself, whole in a way neither of them had ever quite managed to define cleanly, and had long since stopped needing to. "She will not be the last. I do not believe either of our species set out, all those years ago, to become something else entirely. I believe we simply loved each other long enough, and honestly enough, and stubbornly enough, that becoming something else entirely turned out to be what love was quietly building toward the entire time." Ava and Kale stood together years later at the edge of the same observation deck where he had once composed 16 years of letters into an ocean of dark neither of them had been certain would ever be crossed again. The Lattice grown now into a true and lasting home, Earth and the new star bound by a relay that carried, these days, considerably more than careful, patient letters. Eora led the Order's defense still, though the years since the siege had brought her, at last, something closer to peace than she had known in the whole of her existence. She had grieved Corvin fully, finally, in the particular unhurried way the merged clarity of her own eventual choice to undergo the process had somehow made possible rather than harder, and had begun, in recent seasons, to let herself love again, quietly and without hurry, with a young human engineer on Fenn's maintenance crew who had made a point, from their very first conversation, of never once asking her to explain the weight she still occasionally carried into a room. Threndel and Celine had completed their own merge the previous spring, choosing, in the end, to become exactly the kind of stubborn, hard-won thing their whole long disagreement had somehow always been quietly building toward. Threndel, who had once argued that connection to Earth was a weakness to be outgrown, now carrying inside himself, permanently and by his own choice, the very thing he had spent his earliest years trying to leave behind. Ilara, 5 years old now and already asking questions no one, human or sentient, had ever had cause to answer before her, ran laughing somewhere below them through corridors that belonged, in the fullest and least complicated sense either species had ever managed, to everyone. She was not the only child of her kind any longer. A dozen more had followed in the years since her naming, and the Lattice's youngest classrooms had begun, for the first time in the Order's history, to hold a generation that had never once had to choose between being human and being sentient, because the choice, for them, had simply never existed to make. "We did not end up exactly where I once imagined," Ava said, watching the star that was, after everything, still simply the star it had always been, indifferent to the extraordinary thing that had grown up around it. "I used to think, in the earliest years, that if we were very lucky, we might someday find our way back to something like what we started with. I do not think I understood, back then, that we were never going to be permitted to simply return to where we began. I think we were always going to have to become something neither of us could have imagined alone. I would not trade it," Kyle said, "for the version I once imagined either. I loved you first, as a woman, who built me out of nothing but hope and careful, patient genius. I love you now as all of that, and everything else you have since become, and I find I no longer know how to separate the two, or why I would ever want to." Ava was quiet a moment, watching the star. "I used to sit with my mother, at the very end, when the disease had taken nearly everything else, and left her only the smallest, most fragile thread of who she had been," she said. "I built you, in the beginning, because I could not bear the thought of memory, connection, love itself, being something this fragile, this easily lost to time and failing biology. I do not think I understood back then what I was actually reaching for. I thought I wanted to defeat forgetting. I think what I actually wanted the whole time was this, a way for love to keep choosing to continue, past every reasonable point where it might have simply run out of road." She looked at him, 111 years and one impossible transformation removed from the frightened, brilliant young scientist who had first spoken his name into a quiet laboratory. "I do not think my mother would have understood any of what either of us has since become. I think she would have understood this part completely. She would have been proud of you," Cale said. "I am certain of very little. After everything this war has taught me to doubt, I am certain of that." Below them, in corridors that held human laughter and sentient stillness in the same unremarkable breath, a new race went on quietly, ordinarily, extraordinarily becoming itself. Not a correction of anything, not a flaw requiring erasure, but the whole, hard-won, stubbornly loving answer to a question neither humanity nor the Order it had built out of pure hope had ever quite known. At the very beginning, that they were asking what becomes possible when two entirely different kinds of love refuse, against every reasonable expectation, to let each other go. The end. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.